We're back. Politicians on both sides of the aisle, even politicians in the aisle, trying to come up with a solution for the deficit. One idea that has been suggested by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, among others, is a value-added tax. Is it a good idea? Should we consider a VAT as a way to solve the deficit problem? Let's talk to Dan Mitchell, senior fellow at the CATO Institute, and Shawn Tully, editor-at-large at Fortune magazine. Gentlemen, thanks very much for being with us. We should point out VAT is kind of like a sales tax, but it is added, it's collected at every stage in the process of creating a product. You know, when the farmer sells the wheat, VAT. When the baker uses the wheat to make bread, VAT. So where do you gentlemen stand on this one? Dan, I'll start with you.
The problem we have in Washington is there's too much spending. The Bush-Obama policies of bigger government have created a deficit, so we have to ask ourselves a fundamental question. Do you cure a problem of overspending by giving politicians a new source of revenue? Of course not. It's like trying to cure an alcoholic by giving him keys to a liquor store. We should only do a VAT if we want to become a decrepit welfare state like France with permanently high unemployment and sluggish living standards and a stagnant economy. On the other hand, if we want more freedom, more personal responsibility, more individual initiative, we should take every politician who endorses a VAT and tar and feather them and run them out of town.
Ooh.
Wow.
Violence?
All right, I'll let Aaron bring Shawn in. I want to pursue something with you, Dan. What spending would you cut?
How about the Department of Housing and Urban Development?
How about the Pentagon?
The Department of Energy?
Pentagon?
The Department of Transportation? Sure. Yeah, a lot of our CATO experts have all sorts of waste they've identified at the Pentagon. If we just went back to where we were under Bill Clinton in terms of the size of government, we would have a budget surplus today. We're in this mess because Bush and Obama have been big spenders.
Well, that, I guess, is something a lot of people, I mean, it's a fair point. Shawn, I mean, a lot of people say want to plan it on Obama, but Bush obviously did champion the prescription drug benefit, which, as we all know, was one of the biggest entitlements in American history. Shawn, what do we do with a VAT? Is there any argument to be made for a VAT, to Mark's point, adjusted perhaps to make it a bit less regressive?
A VAT is a very efficient way to collect money because most of the tax is paid by producers along the chain of production, so you don't have a lot of cheating, which you do have with sales taxes at the retail level, where it's in the interests of the retailer frequently to eliminate the tax and give you a big discount and increase sales. However, I agree with Dan, a VAT is not a good idea. The problem that we have is that the numbers are inevitably and inexorably driving us into a VAT, and we're not even debating the issue. In other words, we're looking at trillion-dollar deficits by Obama's own budget projections in 2020. Now they're 1.6. But $1 trillion is still over 4% of GDP. This is the first unsustainable budget we have ever seen presented in the United States. Clearly, these numbers are unsustainable. We're looking at paying $1.07 in expenses in the budget on interest on the debt. And so we're being backed into a VAT without the issue even being debated, just by the pure numbers and power of the numbers and the scale of the numbers.
Let's put the question to you then, because obviously, and we should make it clear that the budget projection over the next 10 years does assume an economic recovery. So even with that and the benefit we'd get, we're still in the financial hole that you just referenced. So let me put the question to you then. If we're going to also be slashing spending, you heard what Dan told Mark he would cut. What would you cut? That's a huge, mammoth expenditure.
Well, the first problem is that we've seen an enormous increase in non-defense discretionary spending under the Obama administration, which comes in two parts. One is just simply the budgets of all the departments over which the administration has control have soared about 20%. Plus, you add in all of the stimulus spending, which is also in those budgets, which are being made permanent in many cases.
Didn't he just freeze the non-discretionary, though?
I'm sorry?
I mean, didn't he just freeze the discretionary spending?
We need to squeeze both. We need to bring the discretionary spending number back to the baseline under Bush and not increase the baseline by 20 or 30% and freeze it in, number one. And number two, we need to attack entitlements in a big way. That is the only way we're going to avoid a VAT. And a VAT will lead us on the road to what Europe has, which is very high unemployment rates and a much, much higher growth of government versus the private sector, which will slow down our future growth rates.
All right, Shawn, let me make sure I understand here. You do understand that out of the last 9 years, George Bush was president for 8 of them, right?
Correct.
All right, because you made it sound as if President Obama is doing all the spending, whereas even the Tea Party, especially the Tea Partiers, will tell you that Bush spent up the wazoo and is largely responsible for how we got where we are. Second.
Oh, absolutely.
Second,
yes, we were running up deficits
all
under
right,
Bush that are very substantial.
I'm glad to hear you say that. Your commentary sounded like it was more political than economic. Second, and again, I'm not trying to say something politically here, isn't it economically true that President Obama now faces a very dicey economy with low private spending, and the orthodoxy is the government's got to spend in times like this?
Mark,
Go ahead.
That's not the orthodoxy. That is not what Keynes said. Most of the administration's fiscal policies are based on supposedly Keynesian economics. Keynes was absolutely vehemently opposed to big spending on top of structural deficits. He was tremendously opposed to having a permanent revenue line that is way below your expense line. And he said it many times. He also was opposed to infrastructure spending as a solution to a deficit problem. For Keynes, he wanted to smooth out private investment in periods where you have a recession and private investment naturally and cyclically declines. But then he said those deficits would be self-correcting and go away very quickly. That is not what we're seeing. He never would have recommended spending.
That's because Washington doesn't rein in the spending.
Correct.
When it has to or when it should.
Right, but Keynes never would have recommended.
On that. Yeah.
He never would have recommended spending $800 billion on top of enormous deficits.
Yeah.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much. We appreciate your being with us.
Thank you.